The letter hit the floor of the Sweetwater saloon the same moment Dorothy Grayson's hand came down flat on the bar, her dark eyes blazing with something that sat between fury and devastation. "He is dead," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but every man in that sawdust floor room heard it as clearly as a rifle shot. "James Whitmore is dead, and this entire arrangement, every word he wrote to me, every promise bound in ink and law dies with him unless someone in this town tells me right now what happened to the deed he signed over." The barkeep, a heavy-set man with a red neck and nervous hands, looked at the tall figure at the far end of the bar. The movement was involuntary, the kind of flinch a man makes when he's about to be caught in something he wanted no part of. Dorothy followed that glance like a hawk follows a field mouse. The man standing at the far end was not what she had expected of anyone in Caldwell, Kansas. He was broad through the shoulder and lean through the waist, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same sandstone as the bluffs beyond town. He wore a dark canvas shirt, work-worn, and his hat sat pushed back just enough to reveal storm-gray eyes that were already fixed on her with an expression she could not name. Not contempt, not curiosity. Something older and more complicated than either. "You are Dorothy Grayson," he said. It was not a question. "And you know that name," she replied, "which means you know what I have come for." He set down his glass of water, not whiskey, she noted, in a town where every other man was 3 drinks deep before noon, and turned to face her fully. He was perhaps 32, maybe 33, with the kind of stillness about him that came not from peace but from long practice at containing something volatile. "I am Ralph Carver," he said. "The deed you are looking for is on my land." The silence that followed those words was the kind of silence that changes things permanently. Dorothy had ridden 240 miles from Lawrence, Kansas on a series of stage coaches and borrowed horses, carrying a contract that the late James Whitmore had signed before 3 witnesses, promising her 60 acres of grazing land along Bitter Creek in exchange for a loan she had extended from her father's modest estate, a loan that had kept Whitmore's cattle operation from collapsing 2 winters prior. James Whitmore had died of a fever in March of 1882, and the lawyer in Lawrence had told her flat out that unless she rode to Caldwell and claimed that land before the county recorder's deadline in 30 days, the land would revert to the Carver Cattle Company by virtue of a competing lien. She had not come here to love anyone. She had not come here to stay. She had come because her family's money was buried in that Kansas soil, and she intended to dig it out. What she had not expected was Ralph Carver. The story of how Dorothy Grayson came to be standing in that saloon on the 4th of May, 1882, was not a complicated one, but it was a painful one, and it had begun 3 years earlier in a way she had never fully explained to anyone. Her father, Elliot Grayson, had been a lender in Lawrence, not a banker in the formal sense, but a man of modest means who had built a reputation for extending fair credit to farmers and ranchers who could not access the larger banking institutions. He had done it honestly, recorded every transaction, and never charged a ruinous interest. When he died of a stroke in the winter of 1880, he left Dorothy with a house, a ledger of outstanding loans, and a legal obligation to pursue the debts owed to the estate if she was to maintain any financial footing at all. Most of those debts were small. A handful of farmers had paid in full. A few had settled with goods. But James Whitmore's loan, $400 extended in the fall of 1879, had never been repaid, and James Whitmore had instead written her a contract promising the 60 acres along Bitter Creek as collateral satisfaction. It had seemed generous at the time. 60 acres of good Kansas grazing land was worth considerably more than $400 if a person had the patience and will to do something with it. Dorothy had the patience. She was 27 years old, unmarried not by lack of attention, but by lack of interest, and she had spent the last 2 years managing her father's estate with a precision that had surprised the male lawyers and bankers who had expected her to either remarry quickly or sell off everything at a loss. She had done neither. She had learned and she had waited, and now she had come to claim what was lawfully hers. What she had not accounted for was the Carver Cattle Company. Ralph Carver had been operating his cattle concern out of Caldwell since 1876. He had started with 300 head of Longhorn and an 800-acre ranch on the Kishom Trail corridor, and by 1882 he had expanded to nearly 4,000 acres and over 1,000 head. He was not a wealthy man by Eastern standards, but by Kansas standards he was formidable, and he held liens and water rights across a substantial stretch of Sumner County. He had also, it turned out, extended a loan to James Whitmore in 1880, 1 year after Dorothy's father had made his own arrangement, and that loan had carried a formal lien against the same 60 acres along Bitter Creek. 2 creditors. 1 piece of land. 1 deadline. This was the trap Dorothy had ridden into, and the morning after her arrival at the Sweetwater Saloon, she sat across from Ralph Carver in the small law office of one Silas Drummond, county recorder and notary, and she laid her contract on the desk between them with the steadiness of a woman who had not slept well but intended no one to know it. Ralph looked at the document for a long time. Drummond looked at it. Then Ralph looked at Dorothy, and there was something in his expression that was not what she had been bracing for. She had expected defiance or dismissal, or the particular species of condescension that men in positions of land-holding power typically showed a woman who came to contest them. She had prepared her arguments, rehearsed her legal references, and steeled herself for a fight. What she had not prepared for was the look on his face, which was not defiance at all, but something closer to recognition, as though he had been expecting this, and had expected it to be harder than it was turning out to be. "Your father's contract predates mine by over a year," Ralph said quietly. He looked at Drummond. "Silas, she has priority." Drummond blinked. "Mr. Carver, your lien." "My lien is secondary," Ralph said. "I knew that going in, if I'm being honest. Whitmore told me there was a prior arrangement but said it would never be collected on. I took that at face value, and that was my error, not hers." Dorothy stared at him. He met her gaze directly, no flinching, no posturing. "I cannot in good conscience contest a legitimate prior claim. The 60 acres are yours, Miss Grayson, as far as I am concerned." It should have been the end of it. The clean, logical conclusion to what had been a desperate errand, and Dorothy should have felt relief. She did feel relief, briefly, in the first 3 seconds after he said those words. And then Silas Drummond cleared his throat and said, "There is, however, the matter of the squatter situation." Dorothy turned slowly back to the recorder. "I beg your pardon. 3 men have been running cattle on those 60 acres since Whitmore took ill," Drummond said, with the discomfort of a man delivering bad news he'd been hoping to avoid. "Brothers by the name of Prout. They've built a small structure on the western edge, and they are claiming adverse possession under the territorial statute. Given that Whitmore was incapacitated, and neither creditor had made a physical claim to the land, their attorney, a man out of Wichita, is arguing they've established sufficient occupancy." The relief evaporated. Dorothy sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "How long do I have to contest that claim?" "The county hearing is in 22 days, Drummond said. "You'd need to establish your own physical presence on the property, demonstrate that you are actively using the land, and bring credible witnesses to refute the Prout claim." 22 days. In a county she did not know, on land she had never seen, against 3 men she had never met, with no local standing and no resources beyond the contract in her hand and the $60 remaining in her traveling purse. She looked at Ralph Carver. He was looking at the window. She did not ask him for help. She would rather have walked through fire in that moment than ask this particular man for help, because asking felt like weakness, and weakness in this situation was something she could not afford. Instead, she folded her contract neatly, placed it in her satchel, thanked Silas Drummond for his time, and walked out of the law office into the hard morning sun of Caldwell, Kansas. She made it to the end of the boardwalk before she stopped, because she had nowhere specific to go and she needed a moment to think, and thinking required standing still. She was standing still when Ralph Carver came out of the office behind her. "Miss Grayson," he said. She did not turn around. "I'm not interested in whatever you are about to propose, Mr. Carver. You haven't heard it yet. It will be something along the lines of an offer to help me resolve a situation that is inconvenient for you because you also want that land, or an offer that will ultimately benefit your cattle operation more than it benefits me, or some variation on the theme of a man seeing an opportunity in another person's difficulty." A pause. Then, very dry, "It was going to be an offer of a decent breakfast and some honest information about the Prout brothers, but I appreciate the thorough inventory of my potential motives." She turned around. He was leaning against the post outside Drummond's office with his arms folded, and the morning light caught the angles of his face in a way that was deeply inconvenient, and she pushed that thought aside with the efficiency of a woman who had been making herself push inconvenient thoughts aside for most of her adult life. "Breakfast," she repeated. "Marigold's Place, 2 blocks east. Best biscuits in Sumner County, and she doesn't water the coffee." He paused. "The Prout brothers are not good men, and you need to understand what you are walking into before you go out there alone. That's not a commentary on your capability. It's a statement of fact about their nature." Dorothy studied him for a long moment. The morning was already warm, carrying the particular dry heat of a Kansas May, and the main street of Caldwell was beginning to fill with its daily commerce: freight wagons, horses, a few women in calico, a pair of cowboys walking with the unhurried gait of men who had nowhere pressing to be. "All right," she said. "Breakfast." Marigold's Eating House was a small, clean establishment run by a woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair and an air of absolute authority over her domain. She brought coffee without being asked and biscuits without being told, and she gave Ralph Carver the look of a woman who had known him a long time and was reserving judgment on whatever he was doing. Dorothy wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and looked across the table. "Tell me about the Prouts." Ralph set down his own cup. "3 brothers. Eldon, the eldest, is about 40. Court is maybe 35. The youngest, Hatch, is 26. They moved into the county in early '81, started by working for a drover outfit out of Texas, got let go when the outfit folded, and then apparently decided that sitting down on other people's land was a viable alternative to honest work. And no one has moved them along. They've been careful," Ralph said. "They haven't broken any laws that rise to the level of requiring a marshal, and Sheriff Tate is not a man who goes looking for confrontations he isn't required to have. They pay what little they owe, they stay mostly out of trouble in town, and they've been smart enough to get that Wichita lawyer involved early, which means they understood from the beginning that they were building a legal position, not just camping." Dorothy absorbed this. "And you believe their adverse possession claim has merit? In a narrow legal sense, possibly. If no one had come to claim that land for the next few months, they might have built a strong enough case to take to a judge." He looked at her steadily. "But you are here now, and the moment you establish yourself physically on that property, their timeline resets. You sound as though you have thought about this carefully." "I have," he said. "I have thought about it since I received a letter from Silas Drummond 2 weeks ago telling me that a Miss Dorothy Grayson of Lawrence had inquired about the status of the Whitmore land and would be making a claim." She looked at him. "And what did you conclude?" Something shifted in his expression. It was subtle, the way a fault line is subtle until it isn't. "I concluded that whoever she was, she deserved what she had legally coming to her, and that the Prout situation was going to be her biggest obstacle, not me." She was quiet for a moment, turning her biscuit between her fingers. "Why are you telling me this? You could simply stand back and let me fail." "If I can't establish presence on the land within 22 days, the Prout claim strengthens. The land stays in dispute, and your secondary lien remains active. Eventually, perhaps, you get the land anyway." He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes for long enough that she felt the back of her neck get warm, and she disliked that feeling intensely, not because it was unpleasant but because it was inconvenient. "That would be a dishonest way to resolve a situation that isn't my doing," he said finally. "And whatever else I may be, Miss Grayson, I am not dishonest." She believed him. She was not entirely sure why, except that there was something in the way he said it, not defensively, not performatively, but with the flat certainty of a man stating a structural fact about himself, the way he might state that the sun rises in the east, that made disbelief feel like the larger act of irrationality. "What are you proposing, then?" she asked. "I'll ride out with you to look at the land," he said. "I know those 60 acres well. I have cattle on the adjacent property, and I know every inch of the Bitter Creek watershed. I can help you understand what you are dealing with, and I have men with enough legal standing in this county to serve as credible witnesses in your favor at the hearing. And what do you want in return?" The question landed between them cleanly. She needed it answered. She needed to know the shape of whatever obligation she was stepping into, because obligations taken without full information or how people ended up in exactly the kind of situation she was currently in. Ralph was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down again. "There's a watering easement along the eastern edge of those 60 acres, he said. "It's not in Whitmore's original deed, but it's been used by my cattle for 4 years. If you're going to work that land, I'd like a formal recorded easement for water access. Not ownership, not a competing claim, just the right to bring my cattle to Bitter Creek through the eastern corridor." Dorothy thought about that. It was, in legal terms, a modest request. An easement was not ownership. It would not diminish her own use of the land. And in practical terms, having Ralph Carver's cattle operation as a neighboring interest rather than an opposing one was likely to be more useful than isolating herself entirely. "I will have Drummond draw it up before we ride out," she said. "I want it clear that the easement is contingent on the full resolution of the Prout situation in my favor. If I lose the land, the easement is void." He nodded. "Fair." She finished her biscuit. "We leave at 8 tomorrow morning." The ride to the Bitter Creek property took the better part of 2 hours, and Dorothy spent the first of those hours maintaining the kind of careful distance, conversational, physical, that she had trained herself to maintain in situations where her guard needed to stay up. Ralph rode alongside her on a good quarter horse, dark bay, well kept, and he talked about the land with the specificity of someone who had spent years observing it, not just owning adjacent to it. He told her about the spring that fed the eastern arm of Bitter Creek, which ran clear through summer unlike much of the creek that turned slow and muddy by July. He told her about the stand of cottonwoods on the southern rise that provided shade through the hottest part of the day, and would be useful if she intended to run cattle herself or lease the grazing rights. He told her about the soil composition on the western third, which was harder clay than the rest, and would need different management if she ever thought about any kind of cultivation. Dorothy found herself listening more intently than she had planned to. He was not lecturing. He was not showing off. He spoke about the land the way her father had spoken about the people he lent to, with a kind of respectful attention that recognized value without reducing everything to a dollar figure. "You love this land," she said, somewhat before she had decided to say it. He glanced at her. "I love the whole of it out here. This particular piece is not mine to love. But you have been watching it." "I watch everything in my watershed," he said. "That's not sentiment. That's management." "I think it is both," she said. He did not answer that, but the edge of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile and was not quite not one. When they came over the rise and she saw the 60 acres for the first time, Dorothy understood immediately why 2 different men had been willing to lend money against it, and why 3 brothers had decided it was worth squatting on. The land lay in a natural shallow bowl between 2 rises, with the creek threading along the eastern edge in a bright metallic ribbon, the cottonwoods heavy and green, the grass thick and blue stem mixed with the shorter buffalo grass that meant the soil was good, and the water table not too deep. It was beautiful in the way practical things can be beautiful, with a beauty that is inseparable from usefulness. And there, on the western edge, was a rough timber structure, a one-room cabin of sorts, with a corral beside it holding perhaps 20 head of scrubby cattle, and a thin column of smoke rising from a stovepipe in the roof. As they pulled up, two men came out of the cabin and stood watching them from the shade of the overhang. Dorothy kept her expression level and her posture straight in the saddle. She had dressed for this ride with the same deliberateness she had dressed for the law office, not in the impractical fashion of the eastern cities, but in a serviceable dark riding skirt and a white shirtwaist with a wool vest over it, her dark hair pinned firmly, her father's old leather satchel across the pommel. She looked, she hoped, exactly like what she was, a woman of business who had not traveled 240 miles to be intimidated by men who were accustomed to intimidating. The older of the two men, Eldon Prout, she guessed from Ralph's description, was a heavy-featured man in his 40s with a beard that had seen better decades and eyes that were set close enough together to suggest a general suspicion of everything that came within his field of vision. The second man, Court, was lean and quieter, watching Ralph more than Dorothy. "Carver," Eldon said, "what brings you out?" "This is Miss Dorothy Grayson," Ralph said. "She holds the senior creditor claim on this land by contract dated October of 1879. She's here to formally establish her presence." Eldon's gaze moved to Dorothy with a slow deliberateness that was meant to be unsettling. Dorothy held it without blinking. "Our lawyer says different," Eldon said. "Your lawyer is going to say whatever you pay him to say," Dorothy replied, keeping her voice entirely pleasant. "The county recorder has reviewed the contract and confirmed its priority. I intend to camp on this property for the duration of the claim period, and I have brought documentation that I am happy to have Silas Drummond review again if you would like to pay for another appointment with him." A beat of silence. Court Prout glanced at Eldon. Eldon looked at Ralph. Ralph sat his horse with the stillness Dorothy was coming to recognize as his particular variety of quiet, the kind that was not passive but coiled. "You're welcome to camp," Eldon said finally in the tone of a man who does not believe the situation will proceed as stated. "Free country." "Indeed it is," Dorothy said. "Good morning, gentlemen." She turned her horse and rode toward the creek, and she heard Ralph follow her, and she did not let out her breath until they were out of earshot. "That went better than I expected," Ralph said. "They're waiting to see if I'll actually stay," she said. "They think I'll spend one uncomfortable night and ride back to the hotel." "Will you?" She looked at him. "I came 240 miles, Mr. Carver. I am not leaving because of one uncomfortable night." Something moved in those gray eyes. Not quite admiration, but adjacent to it and warmer. "No," he said thoughtfully. "I don't suppose you are." They established a camp near the cottonwoods, which was Dorothy's choice, practical because of the shade, and because the position gave her a clear line of sight to the Prout cabin while also keeping her close to the water. Ralph helped her set up a canvas lean-to shelter with the efficient economy of a man who had spent many nights on open range. And he did so without commentary on the fact that she directed the process, consulting her on each step. That evening, his ranch hand, a young Mexican man named Tomás, who rode with an easy competence and spoke both Spanish and English with equal fluency, brought supplies from the Carver ranch. A small cook stove, a good bedroll, enough provisions for a week, and a dog-eared but functional copy of the Kansas territorial statutes related to land claims, which Ralph apparently kept on hand. "You keep land law books at your ranch?" Dorothy asked, looking at the volume. "I keep books on most things I deal with regularly," Ralph said. "Land, cattle management, water rights, veterinary medicine." A pause. "History, history," she repeated. "I like to understand how things got to be the way they are," he said. "It helps with figuring out what they're likely to become." Dorothy opened the statute book to the section on adverse possession, and read for the next hour by firelight, while Ralph sat on the far side of the fire and did not crowd her, and did not fill the silence with unnecessary talking. And she found that particular quality in him, the ability to be present without being intrusive, more disarming than anything charming he might have said. Over the days that followed, a pattern emerged that Dorothy had not anticipated, and that she found herself looking forward to with a warmth she continued to examine critically, and then, increasingly, to simply accept. Ralph came every morning, usually by 7, and he always brought something fresh coffee from Tomaz's cooking fire a quarter-mile away where his line camp was set, or a report on what the Pruits had done the previous day, or some piece of local information that was useful in ways she hadn't thought to ask about. He stayed through the mid-morning, helping her with whatever needed doing. She had decided to use this period to begin any visible improvements on the land that would serve as evidence of active occupation, and Ralph had quietly arranged for some fence posts and basic tools to be brought out, and then he would ride back to his own operations for the afternoon and return again in the early evening. On the 4th day, it rained. Not a gentle rain, but the kind of May storm that drops out of a Kansas sky with no polite warning, and Dorothy was in the middle of stringing her first length of fence wire when the sky opened up. She ran for the lean-to, got there ahead of the worst of it, and found Ralph already there. He had been on the property longer that morning than usual, helping her survey the property lines, and the lean-to was not large, and they stood under it shoulder to shoulder while the rain came down in silver sheets over the cottonwoods, and the grass flattened, and the creek rose audibly in its banks. She was aware of every point at which her shoulder was in contact with his arm. She was also aware that this awareness was something she was choosing to attend to rather than dismiss, which represented a significant internal development. "You are thinking very hard about something," he said. "I'm thinking about drainage," she said. "If I want to put a structure on the western rise, I need to understand where the water moves." "East and then south," he said. "The clay soil on the west won't absorb it quickly. You want to sit any structure at least 12 feet above the base of the rise and trench the downhill side." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and they were close enough together that the discovery of this was immediately electric. She did not step back. He did not either. The rain made a white noise wall around the lean-to, and the air smelled of wet grass and creek water and something that was simply him, canvas and horse and the faint, clean edge of wood smoke. "Mr. Carver," she said. "Ralph," he said, and his voice was different, not louder but fuller, as though he had decided to stop being careful about something. "Ralph," she said, and the word felt like the first step onto new ground, the moment when you have not yet committed your weight but you have lifted your heel. "What do you actually want from this situation?" He held her gaze. "You mean apart from the easement. Apart from the easement." A silence in which the rain did the heavy lifting. Then, with the same flat directness he had used in Drummond's office when he had conceded the prior claim, "I would like to know you better, Dorothy, but I am aware that you came here to settle a legal matter and go home, and I am not going to stand in the way of that." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Lawrence, about her house there, her father's ledgers, the quiet and correct and utterly lonely life she had constructed for herself in the wake of his death. She thought about the 240 miles she had ridden, and the 22-day deadline, and the Prout brothers, who were certainly watching from their cabin, and thinking she would crack. She thought about the fact that she was standing under a canvas lean-to in a Kansas rainstorm with a man who had freely conceded a legal claim against his own interest, who kept statute books and history volumes on his ranch, who spoke about land with the voice he might have used for something he loved, and who had just told her with great care that he did not intend to complicate her departure. "Tell me something true about yourself," she said. "Something that is not about the land or the cattle or the Prout brothers." He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression that this was not evasion but genuine consideration, that he was choosing something real rather than something safe. "I had a wife," he said, "Emily. She died in the winter of '79, fever the same as Whitmore as it happened. We had been married 3 years and she was 24, and I spent the following year doing everything except stopping to feel it, because stopping felt like it would be the end of me. I built this operation in that year just to have something to pour the forward motion into." He paused. "I have not spoken about her much since. Not because I am ashamed of it, but because I have not met many people who seem to actually want the true answer to a question." Dorothy absorbed this with a quietness that matched his. She thought about grief, which she knew something about. She thought about the forward motion that fills the space grief leaves, which she also knew something about. She had spent 2 years managing ledgers and pursuing loans that were legally owed but perhaps not urgently necessary, simply because having a clear task was the only thing that had kept the silence at bay. "My father died in 1880, she said. "I was his only child, and my mother had gone when I was 11, so it was just the two of us for a long time. He was a good man. Quietly good, the way people are when goodness is not a performance." "You take after him," Ralph said. She looked at him. "You cannot know that." "I know that you came 240 miles to recover a debt that most people would have written off," he said. "Not because you are greedy, but because it was the last concrete obligation he left you, and discharging it properly is a kind of honoring of him. I recognize that impulse." The rain began to ease, becoming a soft, persistent thing rather than the aggressive curtain it had been, and Dorothy was aware that she had not moved any further away from him during the entire conversation, and that the warmth of standing this close was a warmth she was no longer pretending not to notice. "You are a perceptive man, Ralph Carver," she said. "I have had a lot of quiet time to become one," he said, and then, so carefully it could only have been deliberate, "I hope the quiet time is ending." She did not answer that directly. She stepped out from under the lean-to into the drizzle and turned her face up to it for a moment, letting the rain cool her cheeks, and then she looked back at him over her shoulder with an expression she had not worn in a very long time, something open and complicated and genuine. "We should get back to the fence," she said, but she was smiling when she said it. On the 9th day, the youngest Prout brother, Hatch, rode out to the camp alone. He was a lean, sandy-haired young man of 26 with the look of someone who had ended up in this situation, mostly by following his older brother's decisions, and his demeanor was considerably less aggressive than Eldon's had been. He came with his hat in his hands and stopped at the edge of the camp and said, "Miss Grayson, could I speak plain with you?" Dorothy looked up from where she had been working on a section of fence. Ralph was at the creek, checking the water level after the recent rains, and she could see him at the edge of her vision without looking directly at him. "Speak as plain as you like," she said. Hatch turned his hat around in his hands. "My brothers are planning to move your things when you're not here. Tomorrow, when you ride in for the weekly store run, they're going to take down your lean-to and move your provisions and try to make it look like you abandoned the camp voluntarily. Then they're going to claim to the recorder that you discontinued your occupation." Dorothy looked at him steadily. "And you are telling me this because," he looked at the ground, "because it isn't right. I knew it wasn't right when we started down this road, but Eldon said the land was going to waste and we needed it and no one was coming for it, and I was stupid enough to go along." He met her eyes briefly. "I've got no quarrel with a woman trying to collect what's owed to her. My mother raised me better than that." Dorothy felt a thread of genuine sympathy for this young man who had been pulled along by the ambitions of older brothers and was now trying to find his footing in the consequences. "What will happen if you tell me this? Will your brothers know?" "Probably," he said. "I don't much care anymore. I'm thinking of riding north. There's drover work out of Abilene." "I see." She paused. "Would you be willing to make a statement to Silas Drummond about your brother's intentions?" "In writing?" He swallowed, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Ralph had drifted closer during this exchange, and when Hatch Prout had gone, he stood beside Dorothy and looked at the departing rider with an expression that was thoughtful. "Well," he said, "that changes things." "It does," Dorothy agreed. "We should ride to Drummond's today, and I think I should not be here alone tomorrow." "I'll stay the night," Ralph said, and then, with the careful precision of a man who understood exactly how that sounded, "I have a bedroll and Tamaz can bring supplies. There's nothing improper about guarding a client's property. I've done it before during land disputes." "I know," Dorothy said, "and I would not have you stay on any other basis." A pause. "Though I am becoming increasingly aware that I would also enjoy the company on any other basis as well." He turned to look at her, and the thing that had been building between them for 9 days was right there in the open air between them, undeniable and unfolded. And Ralph Carver looked at Dorothy Grayson in the warm May morning light with the kind of expression a person wears when they have been waiting for permission to want something, and the permission has just been quietly granted. "Dorothy," he said. "Not yet," she said gently. "Let me get through the hearing. Let me have this resolved properly. Then," he nodded once slowly, "then." Hatch Prout gave his statement to Silas Drummond the next morning, and Drummond's expression throughout the deposition was that of a man absorbing information that he found deeply inconvenient for the side he had privately suspected would win. He notarized the statement without comment, and Dorothy thanked Hatch Prout formally and shook his hand, and he rode north the following morning, and she did not see him again. True to Hatch's warning, Eldon and Court Prout arrived at the camp the following afternoon to find Ralph Carver sitting on a fence post reading a Kansas statute book, with Tamaz nearby at the fire and 2 additional Carver ranch hands working on the fence line, and Dorothy herself making careful notations in a ledger at her camp table, as though she were running a Kansas City office. Eldon's face went through several colors before settling on something between frustrated and calculating. He did not come any closer. He turned his horse and rode back to the cabin, and Court Prout followed without a word. On the 16th day, the Prout brothers' Wichita lawyer arrived in Caldwell and met with Drummond, and on the 17th day, he rode out to the property, assessed the situation, and presumably gave his clients advice that had the ring of reality in it, because on the 18th day, Eldon and Court Prout were seen at the county recorder's office. They withdrew their adverse possession claim. They had negotiated, through the lawyer, a final 30 days to remove their cattle and structure from the property, which Dorothy agreed to in writing because she was not a vindictive woman and 30 days was reasonable, and she wanted this finished cleanly. When Drummond handed her the signed withdrawal and her finalized deed, Dorothy Alice Grayson, clear title, 60 acres along Bitter Creek, Sumner County, Kansas. She sat in his office and held the paper in both hands for a long moment and let herself feel the full weight of what it meant, which was not just the land but her father's name, still honored, still kept, carried to its proper conclusion. She was very careful not to cry in front of Silas Drummond, but it was closer than she would have preferred. Ralph was waiting outside. She had not asked him to wait, but he was there, and when she came through the door and he saw her face, the particular expression of a person who has carried something heavy for a very long time and has just been able to set it down, he said nothing at all. He simply held out his arm and she took it, and they walked down the main street of Caldwell, Kansas in the warm late May afternoon without saying anything for nearly 3 full minutes. Then she said, "I owe you a significant debt of gratitude, Ralph." "No," he said, "you helped me considerably. You would have managed without me." She considered this honestly. Perhaps, more slowly, with more difficulty, she paused. "It is not an easy thing for me to accept help. I want you to know that my accepting it from you was not a small thing." He stopped walking. They were at the edge of the boardwalk where the town ended and the open street began, and he turned to face her, and the afternoon light was doing something very specific to his face that she wished she were in a position to study at more leisure. "What happens now?" he asked. "For you?" She had been thinking about this for several days. She had the land. She had the deed. She had, in theory, accomplished what she came to accomplish, and the return journey to Lawrence was a practical inevitability. Except that over 18 days she had come to know 60 acres of Kansas grassland as intimately as she had known any place in her life. She had learned the spring that ran clear through summer, and the cottonwoods that went copper and gold in the fall, and the exact angle at which the afternoon sun hit the western rise in a way that made the grass look like it was lit from inside. She had strung fence wire and read territorial statutes by firelight and eaten biscuits from Tomaz's excellent campfire cooking, and had conversations with a man that went on until the stars were out, and the creek was the only sound. Conversations that covered history and law and grief, and the strange business of building something when everything that had given you a reason to build had already been taken. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "about whether the land is something I want to keep or sell. And I think I want to keep it," she said. "But keeping it means either managing it from Lawrence, which is impractical, or making some other arrangement." He watched her. "What kind of arrangement?" She looked at him directly because she was her father's daughter and she did not believe in hiding behind ambiguity when clarity was available. "I am thinking about whether Caldwell is a place I could build a life. Not whether the land is viable. I know the land is viable. I am thinking about whether the other elements are present." Ralph Carver was very still for a moment. Then, "What elements?" "Good people," she said. "Honest commerce. A community worth belonging to." She paused. "A person whose company makes the quiet feel like something to look forward to rather than something to endure. The afternoon light. The warm air. The distant sound of the Kishom trail's endless commerce flowing through Caldwell's arteries." Ralph looked at Dorothy Grayson with the expression of a man who has been practicing patience for 3 years and has just run out of it in the most welcome possible way. "Dorothy," he said, "I made you a promise 2 weeks ago, that the easement would be the full extent of what I asked for. I meant that then, and I still mean it. But I want to say something else that is separate from the easement, separate from the land, separate from everything that brought you here." "Say it," she said. "I would like to court you," he said, "properly, formally. With every respect to your independence and your intelligence, and your absolute right to tell me that Lawrence is where you belong and ride away from here, which I would accept completely, and which would not change anything I have done or change the easement." The last sentence was important to him. She understood. He needed her to know that what he felt was not transactional, that his help had not been a strategy for keeping her near, and that his wanting her was not a condition of any arrangement she had entered into. She took a breath. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much, Ralph." He smiled then, a full, genuine smile, the first she had seen from him that was not half restrained by propriety or caution, and it rearranged his entire face into something that was deeply and inconveniently wonderful. "Then let's start," he said, "with supper marigolds." "You have a very limited repertoire of social venues," she said. "She makes excellent biscuits," he said, "and the coffee is not watered." Dorothy laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind, but the kind that starts somewhere genuine and comes out before you can decide whether to let it. And Ralph Carver looked at her the way a man looks at something he did not know he had been waiting for. The formal courtship that followed was conducted with the particular seriousness of two people who were old enough to know exactly what they were doing and serious enough to do it right. Ralph called on Dorothy at the hotel every evening when she was in town, and rode out to the property when she was camping, and they walked and talked and navigated the slow and deliberate process of genuinely knowing another person. He showed her the Carver Ranch, 4,000 acres of rolling Sumner County grassland, the main house a solid limestone structure that the previous owner had built in 1874, comfortable rather than grand, with a kitchen that could feed 20 and a library that had actual books in it, which was the detail Dorothy found most telling. She showed him the ledgers she had kept for her father's estate, the careful handwriting, the methodical tracking of every debt and payment, the notes in the margins that were not accounting but observation, her father's voice still alive in the ink. In early June, under the cottonwoods at the Bitter Creek property on a warm evening, with the sound of the creek doing what it always did, and the fireflies beginning their first hesitant performances over the grass, Ralph Carver told Dorothy that he was in love with her. He said it with the same directness he brought to everything, no performance, no preamble, just the fact of it offered plainly. The way he had offered the easement and the breakfast and the honest information about the Pruits and every other thing he had extended to her from the beginning. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. The fireflies moved over the grass. The creek spoke in its even perpetual voice. She thought about the morning she had walked into the Sweetwater saloon with fury and devastation in equal proportion, thinking she was walking into a legal fight and had ended up somewhere she had not known to look for. "Ralph," she said, "I came here to claim a stranger's promise." He watched her, patient, waiting. "And I find that I am not leaving," she said, "because you have made a different kind of promise entirely. Not in writing, not before a recorder, but the kind that is carried in the way a person treats you every day without any audience. The kind that is harder to make and more reliable to keep." She looked at him. "I love you," she said. "I did not expect to, and I am deeply glad that I do." He reached out and took her hand, and that was not a small thing for either of them, the simple warmth of it, the realness of it, after years of each of them being very alone in the particular loneliness of grief and duty and the careful management of everything except the heart. They were married in September of 1882. The wedding was small, held in the Caldwell Methodist Church, officiated by Reverend Holland, attended by Tomás and his wife Rosa, by Marigold and her husband, by Silas Drummond and his wife, and by a small delegation of Ralph's ranch hands who had come in their best clothes and stood with the cheerful formality of people who genuinely liked their employer and had been hoping for this development. Dorothy wore the best dress she owned, a deep blue merino wool, the color of late evening sky, and she had pinned her dark hair up with her mother's tortoiseshell combs, which she had carried from Lawrence without quite knowing why. When she walked down the narrow aisle of the church and saw Ralph at the end of it, standing with the exact quality of stillness she had come to love, wearing a good suit he had made in Wichita, and looking at her with everything he felt entirely visible in his face, she thought about the moment she had walked into the Sweetwater saloon and laid her hand flat on the bar in fury and grief and determination. And she thought about how the distance between that moment and this one was only a few months in calendar time, and something immeasurable in the geography of the heart. Reverend Holland spoke the words, and Ralph and Dorothy spoke their own back, and when it was done, Ralph kissed her with all the care and directness that characterized everything he did, and Tomás made a sound of great satisfaction, and Marigold cried and claimed she was not crying. The reception was at the main ranch house, which Rosa and Marigold had decorated with late summer wildflowers and every available tablecloth, and there was good food and a fiddle player who knew 30 songs and played most of them, and Dorothy danced with Ralph on the wide porch of the limestone house under a September moon while the cattle made their distant sounds in the dark pastures, and the air was cool and smelled of grass and coming autumn. "Well," Ralph said, as they turned slowly in the old fiddle's light. "You stayed, I stayed," she confirmed. "Are you pleased about that?" She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt his arm come around her more firmly and felt the steady beat of him, reliable as the spring that ran clear through summer. "I am remarkably pleased about that," she said. In the months that followed, Dorothy brought her full intelligence to bear on the life she was building, which was not unusual for her and was, Ralph quickly discovered, one of his favorite things about being married to her. She did not merge her 60 acres into the Carver operation. That had never been part of the discussion, and Ralph had never suggested it. She managed the Bitter Creek property as her own concern, leasing the grazing rights to a small cattle operation run by a widow woman named Bess Larkin, collecting fair rent, and maintaining the property with the same methodical care she had brought to her father's ledgers. She and Ralph managed their combined interests with the frank efficiency of a partnership between two people who respected each other's competence and enjoyed arguing about the details, which was its own form of intimacy. They disagreed about stocking rates and agreed about water management, disagreed about the merits of a particular bull Ralph was considering acquiring, and agreed completely about the need for a new root cellar before the winter. And these disagreements were conducted without rancor, and usually concluded, with one of them conceding a point with the grace of a person who was more interested in being right together than in being right alone. By the spring of 1883, Dorothy was expecting their first child. She told Ralph on a Sunday morning in March, sitting at the kitchen table of the limestone house, with the first spring light coming through the east window, and she watched him receive the information with the particular quality of stillness he had when something affected him too deeply for immediate response. Then he stood up, came to where she was sitting and knelt beside her chair in the morning light and took both her hands and said nothing for a full minute because sometimes language is a smaller thing than what it is being asked to carry. "Ralph," she said gently. "I'm here," he said. He stopped, tried again. "I am going to be completely useless for approximately the next hour, and then I am going to be the most practically useful person in Kansas, and I need the hour first." She laughed and pressed his hands between hers, and he leaned his forehead against her knee, and the morning light moved across the kitchen floor, and the ranch made its morning sounds outside, and they were just two people in the enormous and specific ordinary joy of their life. Their son was born in October of 1883. They named him Elliot James Elliot for Dorothy's father, James for no one in particular except that both of them had liked the sound of it, and there was no reason not to give a child a name for the sound of it. Elliot James Carver was, from the first days, a person of considerable presence. He had Ralph's gray eyes and Dorothy's dark hair and an opinion about everything, which he communicated with volume until he had words, and then communicated with words at the same volume. He was the absolute center of the household and knew it, and was not remotely apologetic about it, which Ralph said meant he had clearly taken after Dorothy, and Dorothy said meant he had clearly taken after Ralph, and Tamaz said both of them were wrong and he had taken after himself. The years that followed were good years, the kind of good that is not spectacular but is sustaining, the kind that is made not of extraordinary events, but of accumulated ordinary days that are full and meaningful and shared with the right person. Dorothy continued to manage the Bitter Creek property. When Bess Larkin's lease ended in 1885, she renegotiated favorable terms, and when Bess eventually moved her operation north, Dorothy made the decision to run a small herd of her own on the property rather than lease again, which meant learning the cattle business in practical detail. She learned it the way she had learned everything, by reading every available text, observing every available example, and asking questions without apology. And by 1887, she was running 40 head on the Bitter Creek land and had developed a reputation in Sumner County for the kind of careful, methodical husbandry that resulted in healthy cattle and strong calves. Ralph watched this with an expression that was approximately the same as the expression he had worn when she had walked into Drummond's law office and told him in 6 sentences that she had a prior claim, and then agreed to the easement in the same breath, the expression of a man who keeps being surprised by the same person in ways he finds entirely delightful. In the fall of 1885, Dorothy had returned briefly to Lawrence to settle the final affairs of her father's estate. The house had been rented these past years, but the tenant was moving on, and she needed to decide its permanent fate. She made the journey with Elliot, who was 2 years old and possessed opinions about stage coaches, and Ralph could not accompany her because he had a cattle drive contracted for the same week. She stood in her father's house empty now, the furniture long sold, the walls bare, the kitchen quiet, and she walked through every room and let herself feel the full shape of everything that had happened between her last time in these rooms and now. Her father's desk, long gone. The shelf where the ledger books had lived. The window where he used to sit in the evenings reading, the light coming in from the west. She had a letter in her pocket, written by Ralph and given to her the morning she left, to be read when she was there. She had not opened it on the stage. She opened it now in her father's empty parlor in the autumn Lawrence light. He had written, in his careful, direct handwriting, "Dorothy, you went to collect a debt and stayed to build a life. I know what your father meant to you, and I know that house carries him for you in a way that nothing I can say will adequately address. What I want you to know is this: everything you built in that house, the honesty, the precision, the way you keep your word and care for your obligations and love with both eyes open, all of that came with you to Kansas, and it is the thing I fell in love with first and the thing I will love longest. Your father's house held it. Kansas holds it now. You hold it. That does not change with walls or distances. Come home when you are ready. Elliot and I will be here, and I will have taught him approximately 17 things he is not ready to know. I love you, Ralph." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it back in her pocket against her heart. And she said goodbye to the house the way you say goodbye to things that have been necessary to you and have served their purpose and are now gently, properly done. She sold the Lawrence house to a young couple who were starting out, at a price that was fair, and she rode back to Kansas in the bright fall air with her son in her lap and her husband's letter in her pocket and the deed to 60 acres of Bitter Creek grassland in her satchel and nothing unresolved. In the spring of 1887, their second child arrived. A girl this time, which surprised no one more than Elliot, who had firmly believed that the world contained sufficient persons and had needed no additions. She was named Clara Rose Clara for Ralph's mother, Rose because Dorothy had wanted it, and she had Dorothy's dark eyes and Ralph's jaw and Elliot's extensive opinion about her own existence, which she communicated from the first hour with great certainty. The Carver household became the particular kind of place that children make of places when they are loved and allowed to be themselves, full of noise and negotiation, and the small dramas of people learning who they are, with the large stable gravity of two adults at the center who were in love with each other in the specific, durable way that comes from having chosen each other clearly and continued choosing every day since. Ralph built Dorothy a small office attached to the main house, a proper room with a desk and bookshelves and a west window because she liked the afternoon light, and she ran her Bitter Creek operation from it with the same ledger-keeping precision that had characterized her father's work in Lawrence, and the accounts were always straight, and the correspondence always answered, and the operation always clear. She also began, in 1888, to help other women in the county who were navigating land claims and legal situations, informally at first, lending the statutory books and explaining the language, and then more formally, accompanying women to Drummond's office and making sure the recorder's explanations were adequate and the documentation was correct. There were more women in this situation than most people acknowledged, and Dorothy had the combination of legal literacy, practical experience, and thorough disregard for condescension that made her extremely useful to them. Ralph's view of this activity was uncomplicated. He thought it was good and necessary work, and he said so, and he arranged the household accordingly so that she had the time to do it. And on the evenings when she came home from a particularly frustrating encounter with a system that had not been designed with women's interests in mind, he listened without minimizing it, and he was angry on her behalf in a quiet, useful way that expressed itself in practical actions rather than theatrical gestures. It was in these years, the solid middle years of their marriage, that Dorothy understood most clearly what she had found in Caldwell, Kansas, and why she had stayed. She had come for a stranger's promise, a dead man's contract, ink on paper, the legal residue of her father's careful lending. She had found it, honored it, secured it. And then she had left as she had always planned to leave, except that she had not left in the direction of Lawrence. She had left the uncertainty and the solitude and the quiet provisional life she had been building in her father's wake, and she had walked through a different door, toward a man who had made no promise at all to her when they met, only choices. Consistent, honest, uncalculated choices about how to treat a woman he did not know, and then about how to love a woman he did, and then about how to build something together that was larger than either of them had made alone. That was what she had stayed for. Not the 60 acres, though she loved those 60 acres with a proprietorial specificity that she wore without apology. Not the limestone house, though she had grown into it with the ease of a person growing into something made to fit. But the promise that is not spoken in a law office or before a recorder, the one that is made daily and kept daily, in the way a person shows up and stays honest and makes space for who you actually are. In the fall of 1889, Kansas became the 34th state of the Union, and Caldwell threw a celebration that lasted 2 days and involved most of the county and considerably more whiskey than Ralph personally consumed. Dorothy stood on the porch of the limestone house in the October evening with his arm around her, and Elliot asleep inside, and Clara working hard at staying awake on her father's other arm, and watched the distant bonfires of the town celebration in the dark lowlands, and felt the particular pride of someone who has chosen a place and watched it become something. "Well," she said, "Kansas." "Statehood," he said. 17 years overdue. Better late than never. "That could be our motto," he said, and squeezed her shoulder, and she leaned into him. And Clara put her small, sleepy fist into his lapel and kept her eyes open with the heroic determination of a child who suspects she will miss something essential if she closes them. By 1891, Elliot Carver was 7 years old and already trailing after Tamaz with the focused intensity of a child who has identified his primary interest and intends to pursue it without interruption. His primary interest was horses, not in a romantic, boyish way, but in the precise observational way of someone who wants to understand how something works so that they can do it themselves. Tamaz indulged this with patience and genuine enjoyment, and by his 8th birthday, Elliot could saddle and unsaddle his own pony without assistance and had strong opinions about bit selection that were, Ralph admitted, not entirely wrong. Clara was 4 and primarily interested in everything that was within reach, which was a categorical statement rather than a list. She was the kind of child who exhausted people around her in the most affectionate possible way, and Dorothy sometimes looked at her and saw a mirror of herself at that age, which she suspected was both terrifying and heartening in approximately equal measure. There was a 3rd child on the way by the summer of 1892, and Dorothy, at 37, approached this news with the particular equanimity of a woman who has learned to accommodate the unexpected as standard operating procedure. Ralph received it with the same quality of stillness as before, and then the same hour of emotional paralysis, and then the same efficient and thorough practical preparation, and Dorothy loved him for the consistency of his pattern. Their 3rd child, born in February of 1893, was a boy. They named him Samuel, no family reason, simply a name they both liked, which Dorothy said was sufficient justification, and Ralph agreed. Samuel Carver arrived in a February ice storm that kept the roads closed for 3 days, and meant the doctor came late and Marigold came early, and was considerably more useful than the doctor would have been anyway. Sam was, from the first days, a quieter person than his older siblings, observant, deliberate, with the kind of internal life that expressed itself in watching rather than speaking, until he had something specific to say. Ralph recognized this quality in him with the recognition of a man looking at a version of his own early nature, and he gave his youngest son the same thing he had most needed in his own childhood: unhurried space to think. The spring of 1893 was dry, the kind of dry that Kansas produced sometimes without warning or apology, and it was hard on the cattle and hard on the grass and hard on the general mood of Sumner County. Dorothy managed the Bitter Creek property through it with the methodical attention to water management that Ralph had taught her in the beginning, and they lost fewer head than most of their neighbors, which was not luck but planning. In the drought's aftermath, Dorothy organized a community meeting at the Caldwell Community Hall to discuss water management practices for the watershed, and she presented what she had learned from the territorial statutes on water rights, combined with the practical observations she had made during 4 previous dry seasons on the Bitter Creek land. The meeting was attended by most of the landholders in the relevant drainage area, and the outcome was a formal agreement on rotational water access during low-flow periods that was recorded with Drummond's office and held up through the next 2 dry seasons. Ralph watched this from the back of the community hall, and when the meeting ended and people filed out satisfied, he caught Dorothy's eye across the room, and the look he gave her was one she kept somewhere private in her heart and returned to often. The Carver family moved into the last years of the 19th century with the settled, working confidence of people who have done hard things and come through them, and are not afraid of what comes next. Elliot, at 15, was beginning his serious apprenticeship in the cattle operation, working alongside his father with the focused intensity he had always brought to horses, now extended to the full range of what it meant to run a 4,000-acre ranch. Clara, at 12, was conducting a comprehensive program of self-education using every book in the house library, the general store's small selection, and Marigold's considerable store of practical knowledge, and she had informed her parents that she intended to be a doctor, which neither of them doubted for a single moment. Sam, at 6, was a person of specific and growing presence, quiet and clear-eyed, who had recently developed a strong interest in the mathematics of the land surveys he found in his mother's office. Caldwell in the 1890s was not the same town that had existed in 1882. The Kishom Trail was fading as the cattle drives shifted with the railroads and the fencing of the open range, and the town was settling into the quieter industry of an agricultural community rather than a cattle drive waypoint. Some of the old rowdiness that had characterized the trail town years was simply gone. The Sweetwater Saloon still operated, but with considerably less dramatic incident than it once had. Dorothy walked past it sometimes and thought about the morning she had laid her hand flat on that bar, and the fury and the grief and the determination she had carried into that room, and how she had walked out of it into a life she had not predicted. In the spring of 1897, Dorothy and Ralph made a journey to Lawrence, their first together, the first time Ralph had seen the city, the first time Dorothy had returned since selling her father's house in 1885. They went to put flowers on her father's grave, which Dorothy had not been able to do since before she had left for Caldwell, and they took Elliot, who was 16 by then and the right age to be introduced to the story of the grandfather whose name he carried. They stood at Elliot Grayson's headstone in the Lawrence Cemetery on a May afternoon, the same month of year in which Dorothy had ridden into Caldwell 15 years before, and Dorothy told her son about his grandfather with the specificity of love, the small true things. The way he had said good morning to every person he encountered, the precision of his handwriting, the fact that he had kept notes in the margins of his ledger books that were not accounting but observation, and that those notes had told her more about who he was than anything else he had left behind. Ralph stood beside her and held her hand and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would add to what she was already giving. Elliot listened with the seriousness he brought to everything, and at the end he said, "He sounds like someone you would have wanted more time with." "Yes," Dorothy said, "he does. Then I'm glad you named me for him." Dorothy looked at her son, Elliot Carver, gray-eyed and dark-haired, 16 years old and already the kind of person his namesake would have been proud to know, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and she was entirely full. On the way back from the cemetery, walking through Lawrence's streets, Ralph stopped in front of a bookshop and said, "I want to go in." She knew what he was doing. He was giving her time to collect herself, which he did by creating a task for both of them that required no explanation. She loved him very specifically for this. They spent an hour in the bookshop, And Ralph bought a history of Kansas and a book on advanced cattle genetics that had been recently published in Chicago. And Dorothy bought a novel she had been meaning to read for 2 years. And Elliot bought a manual on surveying, which did not surprise either of his parents. They had supper at a Lawrence hotel, and Ralph ordered good cuts of beef, because he always ordered beef in other towns as a form of professional research. And Dorothy ordered the chicken because she was the only one in their household who did not think about cattle at dinner, and Elliot ordered both and ate all of it. Back in Caldwell, life moved forward with the unhurried momentum of things rooted in good soil. Clara, at 17, had begun formal studies via correspondence with a school in Wichita that admitted women to its preparatory medical program, and she pursued this with the particular fire of a person who has known exactly what she wants since the age of 4 and has been working toward it since. Sam, at 11, was helping his mother with land surveys and had a natural instinct for mathematics that Dorothy was carefully and deliberately nurturing. The Bitter Creek land had, by 1898, been in Dorothy's formal possession for 16 years, and she had turned it into something her father's $400 would not have predicted. The 60 acres were fully improved with permanent fencing, a small barn, a water collection system that made use of the spring, and a herd of 60 prime Herefords that she had built up over the previous decade. The land was worth considerably more than it had been when she arrived, and this was not luck. It was the result of the same careful, attentive management she had brought to everything. She sometimes walked the fence line alone in the evenings, the particular evenings when the light was doing what it did over the western rise, and she thought about the legal battle that had seemed so enormous in May of 1882, the Prout brothers and Silas Drummond and the county hearing and the 22 days of deadline. It seemed from the distance of 16 years like the smallest possible opening through which an enormous thing had arrived. A contract dispute, a watering easement, biscuits at Marigold's, a rainstorm under a canvas lean-to, and a man who told her something true about himself. She had been so careful in those first days, so precise about maintaining the proper distance, the correct assessment of motives, the thorough examination of potential obligations. And she had been right to be careful. She was a woman managing a legal situation in a county that was not hers, and careful had been the right operating mode. But somewhere in the middle of it, careful had simply become less than what was required. Because what the situation had required in the end was not caution but honesty, and she had been honest, and he had been honest back, and here was what that had built. One evening in the summer of 1899, Dorothy was sitting at her office desk after supper, the west window open to the warm evening air, when Ralph came and leaned in the doorway the way he had leaned against Drummond's office post that first morning, with his arms folded, except that this version of him was 17 years more familiar to her, and she knew every quality of his stillness. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked up from the ledger that she had not actually been writing in for the past 5 minutes. "The day I walked into the Sweetwater saloon," she said. He crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite her desk, the good leather chair she had made specifically for the room for him because he spent enough evenings here that the wooden chair had started to feel like an oversight. "And what about that day specifically?" he asked. "That I was so angry," she said, "and so frightened, not that I showed the frightened part." "No," he agreed. "You showed the angry part very effectively. I thought the worst possible outcome was losing the land." He watched her. "And now I understand that the best possible outcome was always standing in that room," she said. "I just couldn't see what it was the best outcome of." He reached across the desk and touched her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat in the warm evening light of her father's imagining made real in Kansas limestone. "I made you a promise," he said, "back in '82, when we were at the creek and you told me about your father and I told you about Emily. Do you remember what I said? You said the quiet time was ending," she said, "that you hoped it was." "It was a promise," he said. "I was telling you what I intended." "You kept it," she said. He turned her hand over and pressed his lips to her palm, which was not his habitual mode of expression. He was not an effusive man, but which was, she had learned over 17 years, the form his deepest feeling took when words could not adequately serve. "I kept it," he said, "and I intend to go on keeping it." The century turned with a particular quality of occasion that Caldwell, Kansas met in its own way, not with the fireworks and speeches of larger cities, but with a community gathering at the new schoolhouse, a building that had been completed in 1895 and represented the clearest evidence of what Caldwell was becoming, which was a real place, with its roots properly down. Dorothy and Ralph stood at the edge of the schoolhouse gathering in the first minutes of January 1st, 1900, and Elliot was somewhere inside playing cards with the other young men of the county, and Clara was in animated conversation with the new doctor who had set up practice in Caldwell the previous spring, and Sam was sitting in the corner reading a book he had apparently brought specifically for this contingency. "How do you feel about the new century?" Ralph asked. Dorothy considered. The air was cold and clear, the stars enormous in the Kansas winter sky, and the schoolhouse windows were yellow with lamplight behind them. "I feel," she said, "that it contains approximately as much possibility as the last one, and that the determining factor will be, as it always is, what you do with it." He took her hand in the cold air. "What do you intend to do with it?" "Oh, the usual," she said. "Manage my cattle, argue with you about stocking rates, watch our children become extraordinary people, read every book I can get my hands on, and not under any circumstances go quietly." He laughed, a full warm laugh, rare enough to be precious, and she put her head against his shoulder in the cold January night air, and the party inside continued, and Elliot won the card game, and Clara and the new doctor had a conversation about medical theory that lasted until the lamp oil ran low, and Sam finished his book and started another, and the stars were what they always were over Kansas. And Dorothy Grayson, who had ridden 240 miles in May of 1882 to claim a stranger's promise, stood in the first night of the new century with her hand in her husband's hand, and felt, with the particular precision she brought to everything she felt, precisely and completely at home. The years that passed into the 1900s were generous ones. Clara pursued her medical studies with the single-minded determination that had always characterized her, and in 1903, she became one of the first women to complete the medical training program through the Wichita Institution, and she came home to Caldwell to practice, setting up in the office next to old Dr. Finney with his full blessing, and the immediate approval of every woman in the county who had been waiting for a physician they could actually talk to. Elliot, at 20, took on formal management of the cattle operation alongside Ralph, and the two of them worked together with the ease of people who have been trained by the same teacher and share the same instinct, which, in Elliot's case, was Ralph, who had quietly and patiently over the years transferred everything he knew. By 23, Elliot was handling the full herd management, and Ralph was stepping back into the role of advisor with the graceful ease of a man who had built something specifically so it could go on without him. Sam, at 17, had developed his mathematics into a genuine study of land surveying and engineering, and he corresponded with a professor at the University of Kansas in Lawrence who described him, in a letter to Dorothy, as one of the clearest mathematical minds he had encountered in 20 years of teaching. Sam read this assessment, thanked the professor politely, and went back to his calculations. In 1906, Dorothy and Ralph sat on the wide porch of the limestone house on a July evening, the same porch where they had danced at their wedding, and watched the light go down over the Sumner County grass in the way it had always done, the gold going bronze, and then the deep blue settling over everything, and the first stars emerging with their customary assurance. Elliot was at the Bitter Creek property that evening, checking on Dorothy's herd. Clara was at her practice. Sam was in Lawrence for the summer, working with his professor. The house was quiet in the way it was quiet sometimes, Not empty but settled, the quietness of a place that has been thoroughly, lovingly lived in and knows it. Dorothy had her ledger in her lap, as she often did on the porch, and a glass of sweet tea, and the catalog she had been reviewing for a new fencing approach she was considering. Ralph had a history book he had picked up in Wichita on a recent trip, and he was reading it with the focused enjoyment that had always characterized his relationship with books, the kind of reading that is not passive consumption but active conversation with the text. They had not spoken in 20 minutes, and neither of them felt the absence of speaking, because the silence between them was one of the oldest things they owned together, and it had never been empty. Then Ralph looked up from his book and across the porch at her, and the July evening light was doing something very particular to the angles of his face, just as it had done on a different kind of evening under a canvas lean-to in the rain 24 years before. "Dorothy," he said. She looked up. "Ralph." "I would like to say something." "Say it," she said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the fact that everything good in my life in the last 24 years has come from the direction of a woman who rode into Caldwell with a legal contract and no patience for nonsense, and that the most fortunate thing I have ever done was understand, within about 30 seconds of meeting her, that I did not want to be in her way." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. "That is a very good thing to say," she said. "I mean it fully." "I know you do," she said. "That is what makes it a very good thing to say." She reached across the porch and he reached back, and their hands met in the July evening air with the ease of 24 years of the same gesture, and the grass moved in the light wind, and somewhere in the distance the Carver cattle made their evening sounds, and the creek that ran along Dorothy's 60 acres was running clear and steady the way it had always run, the way it would go on running. Everything was resolved. Everything was full. Everything that had begun with fury and grief and a legal document and a man at the end of a bar who had said simply, "You are Dorothy Grayson." As though he had been expecting her, all of it had arrived at exactly this. A porch in July, a hand in her hand, children who were building their own full lives, land with her name on the deed, and a love that was the most durable thing either of them had ever made. She came to claim a stranger's promise. She stayed because Ralph Carver made one of his own, not in writing, not before a recorder, not in any form that Silas Drummond could notarize, but in the way he showed up every morning and stayed honest and made space for who she was, and had been doing so faithfully, without interruption, for 24 years. And she had not regretted a single mile of the 240.